Hi, everybody. I am Thomas Howard. I'm one of the ICE technical marketing engineers. I'm here to talk to you today about user and endpoint custom attributes. This is a fairly beginner topic, and what we want to go into today is basically what they are, how you configure them, and of course, how you use them. And this has the potential basically to be a little mini database inside of ICE that you want to maintain with all these different attributes. And so I also want to give you some ways that you can maintain this set of database attributes instead of having to do it manually in the GUI. I'll show you that, but also how we can do it hopefully with some automation as well. And then if you really want to scale beyond this, how you can basically do some additional external database integrations. So the first thing that I want to talk about is why are we even interested in custom attributes in ICE? And the main thing is because you have a lot of endpoints. I have a lot of IoT devices that are kind of they're sort of managed, but they're not really managed by automation. You don't have some kind of a tool to be able to manage them. It's more of a collective that you have to work with other people in your organization, most likely. There might be some kind of a database where you can keep all of this. Maybe you are using your Active Directory for this purpose or some other LDAP or ODBC database. Many customers nowadays also want to store a lot of this inventory type information inside of something like ServiceNow, or maybe even the ability to do more of a cloud-based integration of something like Google Workspaces or other, online spreadsheets or something. But at the end of the day, these are all kind of the same efforts to be able to manage our endpoints that we have that aren't necessarily doing username password authentication or certificate based authentication. Maybe they are, but there's some additional information that you want to be able to track. And ultimately, if you're the only person having to manage all this for all these devices in your network, it can, really impede what you have to do in your daily job and make it not so fun as the ICE administrator. And depending upon how many of these different organizations you have to work with, it can really take a toll on your time. And so how you are able to delegate that and push that out with some kind of automation or have them synchronized can really make a difference. But sometimes, you don't have the time to work with these people, or maybe they're not interested in solving your problem. And so the ability to just have you go in and create these custom attributes straight inside of ICE and do what you got to do to solve a problem, to get somebody on the network, to get a device on the network, those kinds of things. That's what custom attributes are really for. And so, one other thing I like to do is basically kind of compare and contrast them with some other similar ways of managing devices in ICE. So one is endpoint profiles. I'm sure many of you are already very familiar with this. The idea here is we take a look at network protocol attributes when an endpoint comes into the network, and we correlate those things together and we assign it a profile dynamically. And we can organize those things hierarchically, but there's really no way to manage them with APIs today. The next thing is to do something like endpoint groups. And endpoint groups it's not dynamic, it's much more manual. The idea is you have a device with a MAC address and you basically manually assign that MAC address into an assigned group. And then we're able to use that group name in a policy in order to affect an authorization of that device. And then we have custom attributes. And the idea here is that it's very flexible in that you can create any kind of attribute you want. It's not dynamically populated by network protocols, and it's not only a single endpoint group name. You can create anything you want. It can be, department names. It can be cost centers. It can be dates and times. It can be all kinds of different things that you want to be able to use in some kind of a policy to authorize an endpoint or even a user to your network. And it's just a simple flat table of attributes, and we'll go through and show you what that looks like. So you may have seen when you go to to define your users, we have an option for user custom attributes in the settings. And what you're able to do is go in and define different types of custom attributes by data type. And so if you're doing something like a department name, you might use a string, or a location, you might use a string. If you want to do something that is maybe a timestamp, you use a long, or maybe you just want to know, is this asset operational, or what's its, and that would be like a Boolean or something like that. So you have all these different options depending upon how you want to use it. And there's even some ways to create some data type validation with this. So once you create these, it actually shows up in the network access user. You can see it listed, and it kind of inserts itself whenever you go to create a user. You can start manually typing in or adding in those user attributes. So that's how internal users work. And then for endpoint custom attributes, it works very, very similarly. There's a couple differences though, in that it doesn't have the enumeration type, and it doesn't have the options for doing the data validation in terms of maximum string length, or making sure the integer is greater than a certain value or less than another value, things like that. So what I do want you to take away from this, though, is if you look on the right-hand side, look at all the what I call the common uses. These are some of the things that I think people are looking to do. And you might have some more. I'm happy to have you go ahead and post those in the Q&A, and let us know what other scenarios you may be using this for. And we'll try to answer those and see if that's something that we could potentially do later on. So the idea here is sometimes you need to know some of these like inventory, what I like to call just your layer 8 and layer 9 things, right? Whether it's financial or the organizational, political type things. That's what this stuff is, right? It's not network protocols. It's not device types. It's not posture. It's this other stuff that technically we can't track. It's something that you as an organization need to track, and that's where this really comes in handy. All right. So with that, let's get to it. So I'm going to actually spend most of my time today doing the demo, walking through everything with you all, and hopefully this is going to make everything really concrete. So I am sitting here today with, I believe it's ISE 3.1 patch 1. Yeah, 3.1 patch 1. And we're looking at your internal users in ISE, your internal network access users. And if I just take a look at our user Thomas here, if I hover over it, nothing special. I don't see any custom attributes defined. And same thing with this vendor. There's no custom attributes. And if I even go inside and I want to edit the vendor, for example, I don't see any custom attributes anywhere. And that's because we haven't defined any yet. So let's go define those. So we do that over here under settings. And here's our user custom attributes. And we're going to go ahead and define some. And what I want to do is go ahead and I'm going to start typing. I don't like to usually type this stuff, but I wanted to show you how it wasn't visible. But I am going to go ahead and have to type all this stuff in really quick. So bear with me while I get this done. I'm going to add all these in right now so I can just tab across them. So we might have expires and another date, and then we might have a department that somebody belongs to, and that's going to be a string. Where's my string? Oh, there it is. And then we might have an authorization. So we could actually use this authorization to map what security group tag we want to map them to, or what authorization profile name we want to map them to. We have different options for doing things like that. And then we can even come in here and specify the max string length. So I'm just going to say 255. That should be plenty. Okay. And then if we want to put defaults in, we could do that as well, but I'm not going to do that. I'll just save it. Department already exists. Okay. Well, good. We got our department in there. That's all that matters. Um, Probably existed from when I was playing with it earlier. So now that that's done, let's go take a look at our identities again. And if we go in and we take a look at our vendor, there they are. There's our user custom attributes. So now we have the ability to come in and we can specify different parameters. So before we do that, I want to go ahead and perform a network authentication for my vendor. And we'll see how it authenticates and we'll try to change it and see how that affects the outcome. So what I want to show you is some policy stuff that I've already pre-configured here. So we have 802.1x, we have IoT MAB, we have guest, and these are all very similar to what I did last Thursday in the securing Cisco Meraki wireless with ICE. Very, very similar setups, 802.1x, MAB on Wi-Fi, things like that. So I'm using the PORP, the IoT, and the guest SSIDs. And if I go into 802.1x here, basically we're just doing wired or wireless 802.1x, and we're checking for the SSID to end with PORP or for corporate. Then we're going to be doing basic 802.1x protocols here. We're going to allow EAP TLS, EAP TTLS, PEEP, things like that. And once we get in there, you can see we actually have some different things configured. I've disabled some because I'm mostly just going to be using PEEP today. Talking to my internal user database for my two users. And if the authentication fails, bad password or something, we're going to reject it. And if it's not found, it'll just continue on, and we'll see if there's a match in another database or something once we start enabling other authentication databases, identity stores. Then if we go look at the authorization policy, keeping it pretty simple. So I do have an Active Directory that I'm connected to, so I could check for Active Directory domain users and permit access as the employees. I also have the internal database that you saw with my two users, and basically we're going to be matching them for the internal identity group name of employee, and same with an internal vendor group vendor. If none of those match, then we're going to deny access. So I have my iPad over here. I'm going to go ahead and pretend to be the vendor. I'm going to go ahead and log in really fast. And before I do that, I'm going to actually show you my live logs. So nothing happened in here. So I'm going to go ahead and log in. Okay, I just authenticated, and so if I refresh, there we are. Okay, now what you're going to see is I logged in with the vendor account that you saw on my internal users list, and I did it with PEEP authentication, so username, password with PEEP, very typical, right? Then I matched the internal vendor group and got authorized with the permit access. So if I look over here, internal vendor means the identity group name equaled group vendor. So nothing too special about that. But what I would like to do is I want to change that up. So maybe I don't want it to be just a generic vendor, right? I need to make it special for someone, some way, some kind of a different specialized access. And so I want to use my custom user attribute for that. So the way I would do it is I would go ahead and I could just insert a row above. And I want to make it for an internal auditor. And I'm going to go ahead and check for my identity group. My internal user. I want the internal user. I'm going to check for the department. And I'm going to check that it says auditing. And that's all there should be to it. And once that happens, I can go ahead and permit access, and I'm just going to change the security group tag to auditors. Okay? So maybe that gives them some elevated privileges or something here. And don't forget to save it. So if I were to go ahead and re-authenticate, nothing would change because I haven't actually added that auditing information to the department of my user. So let's go do that right now. All right, so here's my vendor and department. If we change it to auditing and save it, hopefully now, if I go back and in my session, I'm just going to re-authenticate this guy here. Hopefully this will work nice and easy. And if I refresh, there it is. Okay. So I went from being a generic, contractor, vendor type person to being an internal auditor this time. And the way it did it was by matching that internal department, right? So you can see it picked up the department and it matched on it. And so if I search on department some more, you can see that it actually queried the database down here, selected the appropriate authorization rule to permit access, and there we go. So that's how I was able to use that user attribute very, very simply to customize an authorization rule. So that's pretty much all there is to it. We're going to go do it for endpoint custom attributes now. So here we go. Back in settings, we have endpoint custom attributes. And in this one, I put a lot more attributes. So I already just pre-populated. I didn't want to waste your time watching me type all this stuff in. But I want to give you the idea of some of the things that you can do. So authorization, like I said, if we want to override something. Whenever we're talking about keeping an inventory of assets or devices, it's always a good idea to identify who is the owner, right? As well as what department do they belong to. And like I said, maybe you want to have some kind of a cost center or some other thing that you care about. Instead of location, I use the word where because the attribute named location is actually used by profiling, so we can't use that, so I just said where. You saw me do IPSK last week in the webinar, and so we're going to carry that over and do it again here today. And if you want to track things like what's the OS, what's the manufacturer of the device, what model number is it, those types of things, that may be of interest not only to you, but maybe to whoever is actually managing devices. You may actually want to use somebody else in your organization to log in and update these things or push an update to ISE via API so that you don't have to manage all this information. Let somebody else do it, distribute it amongst the organization, and then they synchronize it in with ISE so that you don't have to do all that manually. And something might be, when was this device created? When was this entry created? Like if it's like 7 or 8 years old, like is this device even around? Like should we have expired it? And so it's always good to have like that expiry date on there so that you kind of know for your own auditing purposes of when to update something in the database. Device type, you may want to know what device type something is, just like we did with profiling. Sometimes there may be something that you want to categorize this thing into as an endpoint group or something. So having the device type there is really nice. And like I said, we can do things by date or by like a Unix timestamp. So that's there for the long. So just to give you some ideas of some different options available. So that's our endpoint custom attributes. All right. So now what we want to go ahead and do is I have some Raspberry Pis. And what we want to do is authenticate them. So what we're going to do is we're going to close that. And we're going to go take a look at this other policy set for IoT MAC authentication bypass. So if our device comes in by a wired MAB or wireless MAB, and if it's wireless, we want to make sure they are in the IoT SSID. We don't want to do this for anybody in the corp one because they're going to be doing authentication normally. So if they're in here, what we're going to do is simply look for endpoints in our internal database. And if they're not, if they're not there, that's okay. We'll just continue on down, and eventually we'll find a match for them and authorize them. Because this may be the first time we're seeing it, but based on some of this information, hopefully we'll know about it, or we can update it and it'll be authorized appropriately. So by default, if we don't know about it, right, if it's not one of our assets that we know about, we probably don't want to let it on the network. Or if we do, it's probably going to be a guest, or somebody didn't update the database properly, and so it's going to hit that deny access by default. Otherwise, we always can rely on our ISE profiling capabilities to update something. So you could have lots of rules here for different IoT profiles and how you want to update them based on ISE profiling. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to plug in both of these Raspberry Pis right now, and let's see how they authenticate. While that's happening, I'm going to just finish explaining these other things. So what I want to do is, first we're going to authenticate the Raspberry Pi by profile. So we're not going to actually use any of those special attributes we talked about. Then we're going to override that assignment, even though, yes, we know it's a Raspberry Pi, but we actually want to do something special with it, and we want to make sure that it's a part of the IT department's IoT devices. And so we're going to authorize it that way. We're going to go ahead and we can actually check to make sure it's in an identity group. And once we know that, we can also do our IPSK assignment. Make sure that it has the right IPSK to be joining our network here. And if so, then we'll put it in our signage group. And then finally, with the other Raspberry Pi, it's actually one of our facilities sensors. It's being used to sense data and track data in the facilities department. And so once we detect that, we're going to make sure that it's IPSK, the pre-shared key matches as well. And if so, then we'll put it into the IoT group. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at our authorization. So here we go. So it looks like we have our two Raspberry Pis. They both came in. So we have BB and F8. I'm just going to call them BB and F8 just for short. And you can see they both got mapped into the IoT Mab Raspberry Pi group, just like we expected. So what we want to do instead now is let's try and take the signage one, and I'm going to put it in the IT department. So let's go back out here, and let's go take a look at context visibility. So context visibility endpoints is where you're going to track all of your endpoints in ISE, right? So if you look here, you should see that we have the F8 and the BB Raspberry Pi devices. And we scroll over, look at all the information that we picked up, right, through just the network attributes and things dynamically. So some of the attributes that you see here in context visibility are static, like we can configure from our custom attributes, and some are dynamic. They're learned as we see the device, we get profiling information, we authorize it, things like that. So whenever you see stuff in context visibility, it's kind of a mashup of all these different kinds of attributes and information. So what I want to do is, rather than look at this default view, I actually want to go up and create a new dashboard view. I don't know if you've ever done this before, but if we take a look, I want to create a custom attributes view. And I don't know why it does this sometimes. I'm using Firefox, and sometimes it has a problem. So let's try this again. If not, I'll have to switch to Chrome. Create new. There's my categories. All right. So interesting here. Look at all these. You can see we have up to 100 different attributes that we could potentially be looking at in context visibility. Or if you want to filter it down, you can always do that. I always like to see everything, so I'm going to choose all attributes. And now I'm going to call it custom attributes. And I don't care about dashlets. I just want to see the data, so I'll save that. And then the other thing you can do is there's a little lock. If you hover, you see the little lock appear. If you click on it, now if I refresh the page, it'll just magically land on that first. There we go. So it's always going to land there. All right, so now that we're here, check this out. Look at these custom attribute fields. Pretty cool, huh? So these are the custom attributes that we've added in, and notice that they're totally empty because we haven't actually added anything in there yet. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm not going to type this in manually. That's way too much work. I'm definitely more of an automation guy, and that's why you saw that our next webinars next month are going to be on using REST APIs with ISE and using Ansible with ISE. So what I want to do is I want to come over and see if I can there we go. So if you don't understand this, that's okay. Tune into the webinars next month and hopefully it'll begin to make a lot more sense. So what we're looking at here is a little Ansible playbook. And what we're going to do is I'm going to create endpoint information for those two Raspberry Pis. So I'm going to connect in, I'm going to add, for this MAC address, I'm going to add these attributes. And you can see we got some of that department information, we got the IPSK information, what device type it is, model, manufacturer, all that good stuff. And same thing with this other Raspberry Pi that's one of our, used for digital signage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the playbook. And hopefully it's going to connect to my ISE using Ansible. It's using REST APIs to configure this. And that fast, those fields should be populated now in ISE. So if I refresh this, I was worried that was going to happen. Let's try if I do a full reload. I don't know why that happens. Let's go and I'm going to take a look and see. What you can also do is if you wanted to add these things manually in here, is if you click on the MAC address, this is where you can look at all the different attributes that are available for different things. We haven't done any authentic. There's no other threat and vulnerability information. So we're just going to look at the attributes. So you can see we've already profiled it as a Raspberry Pi device. And if I go into custom attributes, you can see I have some here, but it's not populated. I don't know why it decided not to populate. It should have. The one thing I can think of is that I know there's a bug where it doesn't like to add endpoints that are already created with the APIs. So I'm going to try it one more time and see if that works. If not, I have one more trick up my sleeve. So let's go take a look and let's see if we refresh it. Attributes, custom attributes, not there. Okay, so what I'm going to do, my other trick is I'm just going to go in and I'm going to wipe out those endpoints so that they're not there anymore. And hopefully, since they're not in, I can now create those endpoints fresh and new. All right, let's try and see if they're there now. There they are. Oh, good. That's what I was hoping for. Yeah, it's the bug with the REST API and trying to recreate an endpoint that already exists. It's not going to work. So the attributes that you saw listed in my Ansible playbook are sitting right here. And so you can see we have our two Raspberry Pis. One is for signage, one is for facilities. And we also have other things in here for the department, the individual pre-shared keys, the device type, what model number, operating system, who's the owner, and other information, right? So with that, what we can do is we can now go in and we can edit this. So let me go to, let's see, we said, kind of got distracted, let me make sure. So for IT, the signage, first we're going to do the signage, we're going to put it in the IT department. That's what we're going to do. So let's go over here and look at my signage one, which I believe is this one. Look at those attributes again, and you can see now the description got populated. There's those attributes we were looking for. All right, so with that, what we can do is, yeah, the department's already currently IT. It wasn't there before, so it just relied on ISE profiling to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and plug my Raspberry Pi back in. And this time it should re-authenticate, and we should see it come on and be a part of, oh, it helps when you actually enable a policy. And since we're here, I may as well go ahead and I'm going to turn on the signage one too, and the facilities one. Let's just do it all right now so I don't forget. So the idea here is we can now use department information to assign these to override the default endpoint profile. It's good that we know from ISE profiling that it was a Raspberry Pi. That's great. But we actually need to tag it and assign it to a different group. And so for facilities, we could actually come in and choose a different group in here if we wanted to for facilities if we had a different group. But I didn't create it, so I'm not going to do it today. Go back over here, and there it is. Okay, so our Raspberry Pi came in, the F8 one came in, and it got authenticated and authorized into the IT IoT group. And that was because you saw that we had IT in the department name. What I want to do now is we gave it a basic permit access authorization, that's fine. But really, if we're talking about doing MAB authentication, we need to secure this thing. It's not good enough to say, yeah, MAB, come on in. That's not very good. That's very insecure. And so what's better is if we start to assign an individual pre-shared key to each of our devices, or maybe it's a NPSK multi pre-shared key. So we have groups of devices that share the same key. Either way, that's what we want to do here. So let's go get our device and let's assign it. So what we're going to do is we're going to get away from context visibility, and we're going to go over into our identity groups for endpoints. And inside there, you can see we have lots of different identity groups, including one for signage. And you can see we have not assigned any MAC addresses, any endpoints to this group manually yet. We're going to do that right now. We just hit add. There's the F8. We click on it, and it is now added into the signage identity group. And if we go back to our live logs, and what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to give it a little kick off the network and have it come right back, hopefully. Just thinking about coming back. Well, think about coming back. I may have to unplug and replug it if it doesn't like it. Okay, Raspberry Pi, we're going to reboot you. All right. So I unplugged and replugged him, so he'll come back and hopefully rejoin the COA. He didn't like the change of authorization. So I also plugged in the other Raspberry Pi, and if we take a look at that one in context visibility, so the BB one, we look at its attributes, custom attributes, you can see that it has the Department of Facilities. And so when we see the facilities department, it should match this rule because the endpoints department is facilities, and we're going to apply this IPSK. And once it authorizes, I'll go show you what these two look like for authorization in terms of the authorization rules. Okay, there we go. Looks like we got a couple of, yep, there they are. There's our two pies. And there we go. So we have the one pie came in as signage, and it was authorized using the individual pre-shared key for signage. And then the other pie came in and it mapped to the facilities department. And so we made sure that we used the individual pre-shared key for endpoint attributes. I'll show you why that's special. So what we do is we go into our results for authorization. Take a look at those authorization profiles. And I've done a couple of things here. So one is the individual pre-shared key for signage. And bring this up. There we go. So all I'm doing is if this matches, I am using my Meraki access point, just like I was using last Thursday for the Securing Cisco Meraki with ISE webinar. We're using the radius tunnel password. That's how we communicate the individual pre-shared key for this endpoint to Meraki. And so Cisco 123 was the IPSK, and it's going to send this back. And if that's what the endpoint is trying to use to communicate, Meraki is going to let it into the network. The other profile is a little bit different. This is where it gets really cool with individual pre-shared keys and custom attributes. And I showed you this last week as well. So this time we're not hard coding that pre-shared key. So you can imagine if we were doing multi-PSK, that a hard-coded pre-shared key would make sense here. But since we want to truly do individual pre-shared key, the best way to do this is to have it reside with the endpoint itself in its asset inventory information, right? And that is coming from the endpoint database inside of ISE, the custom attributes, and this is the IPSK attribute. And so what it's doing is ISE is actually looking up what is the endpoint IPSK value for this endpoint in the authorization rule. When it comes in, it's going to go ahead and find out what it is. And if we go look at our thing here, right, it's this crazy IPSK down here. And so if that's what this device is using as its pre-shared key to communicate on the wireless network, it should be good. And so if I go over here to my Meraki wireless network, and I'm just going to give it a refresh, you can see I'm just filtering on my endpoints on my IoT SSID. And you can see we've got Raspberry Pi number 1 and Raspberry Pi number 2. There's the F8 and the BB, and they're green. So they are online. Their pre-shared keys matched, and we were able to let them on the network. So hopefully you guys can see how we're able to use some of this, I call layer 8 information, whether it's the financial or political, departmental, organizational type information that you can store with your endpoint inside of ISE and be able to use that to do these kinds of mappings and authorizations to do whatever you need to do. Sometimes you might have somebody come in and you need to override it like I did with the auditor. So that's a great option for you. And at the end of the day, what we want to be able to do is update, not there, context visibility, that's what I'm looking for. In context visibility, one of the things you may want to do is you saw me do an update using Ansible. We could also use Python. So if I come back over here, This is my Ansible script. I tend to like that a lot more. I think it's a little easier to read without having to do all the scripting. But if you're comfortable with Python or curl or anything like that, you can do it, the old-fashioned way with all the JSON and the curlies and the quotes and everything like that. No problem. This would work just as well. I made a little shell script to do it here. So this should work too. And one other option for those of you that may not be as programmatically inclined is to go ahead and do an export. Now, I have to say, I'm not really happy with the context visibility export. This is one of the things I've been complaining about. The ability to export all the attributes, and then let's go ahead and let's open this up in Excel. And so obviously there's only a few devices in here, so it's not too crazy. Let me blow this up so you can actually read it. The takeaways here, we've got Raspberry Pi. If we go take a look, we scroll over, and well, I better scroll this way. This is going to take forever. If I really scroll, keep scrolling, there they are. Look at those custom attributes. There they are. So it exported the custom attributes. If you wanted to edit them, let's say we wanted to make, I don't know, what do you want to do? Let's make this guy a member of the signage group also, and then save that, and then import it back in. Here's the problem. If I go back to ISE, and I want to import it back in now that I've made some changes from file. Unfortunately, remember what I said about all those attributes being a mix, a mashup of dynamically created endpoints from protocols and profiles and all those different things, and the hard-coded static things that we did as part of the custom attributes? Well, look what happens. So it doesn't like some of the attributes. Some of those attributes are not, it doesn't want to be able to import them because they're dynamic, right? So if you think about it, like MDM, that's fairly ephemeral based on whatever the endpoint compliance might have been. And same thing with the network device that's coming in on. These things probably don't really matter, but you'll notice that the custom attributes aren't on this list of things that aren't supported. So what you would need to do is go in and create your own little template of things that are importable, and that should include the customizable attributes. And so if I come in and I do an export again of importable only ones, and I export that, let's bring this over, blow it up. Now, if I scroll over, there's not nearly as many columns now. And that includes my custom attributes. So it's really weird and inconsistent. I was not happy when I discovered this, and this is another reason why I like to do everything with APIs and automation. So one thing I found is, let me go back to ISE. If I go to import, and I look at the template, if you generate a template, you open it up, you should see only the fields that you want, or only the fields that it will allow, I should say. And some of those fields should include, ta-da, look at that, custom attributes. So it should accept the custom attributes, but just be aware that you want to export that template and then update your attributes appropriately for those endpoints in this template if you're going to be using CSVs, okay? So the last thing I wanted to talk about was I mentioned the ability to do external databases. So you can imagine, so you can see how I'm sitting here playing around. I'm doing CSVs and I'm manually updating things in the GUI, and I'm using Ansible or other APIs and things. And I, at some point, I'm going to hit a wall in terms of productivity, and I'm going to need to somehow have sort of a larger database potentially on the outside, or really what it is it's a way to manage it with lots of different people. I probably don't want to give access into ICE, into the GUI, for different people in different departments to update their endpoints in ICE itself. It might be better to do it somewhere else centrally, like Active Directory or an LDAP server or an ODBC database. There's even the IPSK manager. We talked about that last week as well. If you really all you want to do is IPSK, IPSK is probably the best way to go about doing it. And if you've been watching our webinars, you will hopefully remember that we talked about a great new feature in ICE 3.2 called pxGrid Direct. This is the ability to query an external database and retrieve JSON information out of it and map that basically into a table, and then it'll continually query it and update the information in that table on a periodic basis. And so those are the different options. Let me just take a moment to kind of explain why you would care about some of these different options. So we've been talking about custom attributes in ICE, right? And that's what this is right here. So obviously it's free, it's included. You don't need to talk to anybody else because you're the ICE administrator. You can do whatever you want with it. I haven't really seen what the maximum number of objects is. At some point, all of these things have to get replicated out to ICE, and it's going to take up memory and things like that. I do know there's a 100 attribute limit, so if you have more than 100 columns of data that you want to track, you're going to quickly outgrow custom attributes in ICE. And plus, since you have to manually add everything anyway, I don't think anybody would want to manually add 100 attributes or more. So you're probably better off doing something else. The one thing that's great about it is notice that there is virtually no latency. I said none just because it's near zero. It's like single to double-digit milliseconds. It's really, really, really small. When you compare that to going out over a network to some of these other databases, right? Whenever you're doing an external query over a network, stuff can happen. And so depending upon where it's located, how your network is performing that day, it can take time and impact the performance. Whereas if you got a local copy here, that's fantastic. Same thing with pxGrid Direct. It makes a local copy of that external database, that JSON table, keeps it local so that there is very, very little latency. So that's the big advantage there. So AD LDAP, if you don't have AD, well, be prepared to pay, but you probably already do have it. You've probably already made the investment. So if you want to use AD, it's just an LDAP server. So yes, we have the ability to integrate with an LDAP server and do queries that way. ODBC, pretty much the same. It's a generic, not quite as much as the Microsoft Active Directory, so that should work. And the interesting thing here is because these are, external databases, hopefully they scale really, really well. So you should be able to have lots of information in there, lots of columns, lots of rows, and be able to do all that. pxGrid Direct, I haven't really seen a final answer yet because 3.2 just came out today if you hadn't heard. So you can go download ICE 3.2 on Cisco.com, go take a look at it, go play with it. If you weren't part of our beta, then you can enjoy it now. And you can learn all about pxGrid Direct. I haven't seen the final scale numbers on the number of columns and rows that it's able to accept. So that's why I put a little asterisk next to that one. But otherwise, you should be able to take in, many, many megabytes of data and replicate it across the PSNs. So ultimately what we're talking about here is management of this information and how you manage it. And so that's where, like I said, if you have somebody that's managing that device, they have to log into ICE to update the device, the endpoint. maybe that's not a good idea. You don't want them logging into your ICE and messing anything else up. Same thing over here is you've got to work with some of those database admins, right? The Active Directory identity admins or the database admins. IPSK manager, depending upon who owns it, if that's you, great, no problem. And you're able to create custom roles within that application to determine who's able to make certain updates. And then same thing with pxGrid Direct. That's really a matter of who's going to log into the box and who is managing that external JSON database table. Is it housed in ServiceNow? Is it just a JSON table that you made up? And I tell you that because I actually made one, and I'll show it to you here real quick. So real quick, I want to go through and talk about pxGrid Direct for those of you that may not have seen it in ICE 3.2. This is one of the features I'm really excited about because you're able to get basically a table of information from some external database like ServiceNow. ICE will parse that, store it locally as a table, and now it's available like an endpoint database in order to do things like authorization policies and things like we were doing today. It's exactly the same thing we're doing today, although instead of being added manually via API or via the GUI, it's done by syncing it via a REST API from an external server. And this is really cool because if you look at something like ServiceNow, there are many columns of data, like well over 100 columns, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of rows of endpoints potentially, depending upon the size of your organization. And if you look at the data that is typically housed in something like ServiceNow, you have your primary key, you have things that can determine if it was recently updated to synchronize it. We can do things like our security group tag, we can do group information, we can find out is the endpoint operational, has it been retired, is it should it no longer be on our network, what's the status of it there. So all these different things we can do. And one other thing I'll mention is there's another document, another use case I didn't go into today, but the ability to actually use dynamic access control lists per user. You have the ability to do that with ICE user custom attributes. So that's an option. If that's something you're looking at doing, that's another option for you. But I wanted to show you, let's see if I have it. There it is. Okay. So what this is, once we get more into the Ansible stuff, I might actually show you guys this next month. What this is I have created or have the ability to create a web server in AWS via Ansible that runs NGINX as a web server and basically serves up this JSON file. This is exactly how we would do the integration with pxGrid Direct. Only instead of doing, that CMDB table like you would do with ServiceNow, we have the ability to do it for IPSK. And maybe you had some other front end that allowed people to edit this database, but then when ICE synchronized with it, it spit out the JSON data like this, right? So I'm just trying to give you guys ideas on how you could do this with something like pxGrid Direct to do something similar to what we did today with, IPSK values or status or departments and things like that. So that's just something I want you to be thinking about. If this kind of integration or this type of solution would help you in better managing your IoT or other endpoints with ICE in your network. So that was pretty much all I wanted to talk about today. Remind you all, we've got lots of videos that we put out in the ICE webinar space as well as our YouTube channel. So if you missed anything or if there's things you want to know more about that we didn't talk about today, I encourage you, please go look. We probably covered it already, or we have something that might help you address whatever you're trying to do. So take a look at those. And then, of course, we have all of our ICE resources for you as well. So take a look at those. And those should link to many of the documents and guides and things that will help you do many of the things we talked about today. And if not, then we'll see you next month for all the cool ICE API and automation stuff that I'm going to be talking about. So Rigo, how are we doing on questions today?
Hey, Thomas. We're doing great. Huge thank you to our panelists. It does look like we have one outstanding question remaining. And for that question, can you show the license consumption dashboard to check how policy and profile are consuming?
Sure. Let me get back to ICE, cancel out of here, go into the administration licensing, and there's my consumption. Because I was doing profiling, I consumed 2 Advantage licenses. And then with my iPad, when I did the vendor authentication, that was a straight basic 802.1x authentication. So that's only using an Essentials license. So there you go.